We on, Josh? We're recording? Great. Good afternoon. My name is Rivka Schwartz. I work here at SAR High School, but I'm actually speaking to you this afternoon also in my capacity working for Machon Siach in memory of Belda K. Lindenbaum at SAR High School. Machon Siach is an institution within SAR that tries to take high school teachers and give them more time to think about, research, write about, work on big important questions that show up in the lives of a modern Orthodox high school students, but that aren't the day-to-day matters that have to be dealt with immediately that tend to draw most of our attention and focus. So on any given day, right, which kid came late and who got in trouble and which teacher is absent and their class needs to be covered is the biggest crisis I have to think about, and really big fundamental questions about what it means to be a modern Orthodox committed observant Jew in our complicated and changing world might not be the top thing on my list of things to do, which might mean that we might not get around to making a lot of time and space for them. Or teachers just might be busy preparing for their classes and grading their papers and teaching their students. And so what Machon Siach does is it carves out space. And it gives teachers time and space and resources to sit and engage with and think about and work on some of these really big and important questions, and it's really quite wonderful. And if you don't know more about the work of Machon Siach, you should get on Machon Siach's mailing list to find out about it, because a lot of interesting stuff goes on. One of the Machon Siach cohorts, one of the faculty groups that got underway this year, is a cohort thinking about citizenship. And so some of the work that underlies the ideas, the topics, the things I'm going to be talking about over the next few sessions, that work was done under the aegis and with the support of Machon Siach. We were originally supposed to have 4 sessions. The snow apparently has cut us down to 3, so we're going to start here and see how much we can get into 3 sessions. And so this, I want to make clear, I know that you're always not supposed to do this in a speech. You're never supposed to start off a speech by talking about what it's not about. You're always just supposed to be positive, but I'm going to start off by talking about what it's not about. Because for us, this question of thinking about citizenship was not about politics. It was not about specific political engagement, supporting this issue or that issue, this candidate or that candidate, this party or that party. It was a broader and deeper question of how do our students think about themselves as American citizens and committed Jews, and really, how do we teach them to think about themselves as American citizens and committed Jews? Because one of the things that kind of came out as we did a little bit of cheshbon hanefesh, a little bit of soul searching around this, was that we hadn't actually spent a lot of time teaching towards or educating towards what it meant to be an American citizen as a committed Jew. And in that, in fact, we track the patterns in the broader world.
It's going to break.
Where once upon a time, citizenship and education in citizenship was a requirement in any civics, right? Civics is a class in citizenship, was a requirement in any high school class, was a requirement towards graduation. And civics education in the United States has been on a multi-decade decline, replaced by all sorts of other things that it might have been replaced by, but civics education in the United States has been in a long-term decline. They're actually now, as we as a country start to grapple with the questions of an increasingly polarized body politic, and very deep divisions around politics that seem to divide us in a way that's more than just I think this way, you think that way, but that seem to be more profound and fundamental. There's now a lack of sense of shared understanding of what the basic values and commitments of our democracy and our democratic citizenship are, that we should all share, whatever our political positions or views. So you're now seeing a resurgence in interest in educating towards and about citizenship. SAR High School is actually participating in one such project to develop shared citizenship curriculum for yeshiva day schools and Catholic schools, out of a sense that there are certain kinds of religious values that are implicated in talking about or thinking about citizenship that could be meaningfully pursued both by yeshiva day schools and Catholic schools in New York City. And so we're involved in that. That's not part of Machon Siach, but we're involved in that undertaking or project as well. So citizenship education has been getting something of renewed attention because people realize that people realize that you need it after you stop doing it for a while, and then the wheels start coming off the train, and they're like, oh yeah, we probably should have done some more of that thing. So now people are starting to pay attention and do some more of it. And we internally as a school are really devoting, through Machon Siach right now, are devoting time to thinking about and asking these questions that we might not have devoted as much time to or spent as much time thinking about before. So we do a great job teaching American history. We teach students a lot about our shared history and about our past, but the question of what it means for us to be engaged citizens is not something that we, to this point, have spent as much time on, but are starting to spend serious time on now. So to launch us into this conversation, before we get to American citizenship as American Jews, and what it means to be citizens in our American Democratic Republic, I wanted to start by looking at a few sources that look at our understanding of our relationship to the broader secular non-Jewish government under which we live. Because that's a broader category under which the category of how do we relate to the Democratic Republic under which we live is a more specific category. And of course, there are centuries and millennia of Jewish history of examining how we relate to the broader government under which we live, because Jews have been living, it's just one sheet. You can pass it out, it's just one sheet. Can you pass one down to Tila? Jews have been living under a secular government for a very, very long time. Right? How long? Well, going back at least to Yirmiyahu Hanavi, the prophet Jeremiah, who is talking to the Jewish people on their way into exile after the Churban Beit HaMikdash, after the destruction of the first temple. After the destruction of the first temple, and they're going to exile in Bavel, in Babylonia. And he says to them, the pasuk that became the title for this series of talks, Dirshu et shlom ha'ir asher higleti etchem shama. Seek out the welfare or the well-being of the city to which I am exiling you. Okay? So God says to the Jewish people, pray for the well-being, through the prophet Yirmiyahu, God says to the Jewish people, pray for the well-being of the city to which you are being exiled. The rest of this pasuk that I cut off is, because through her peace, through the city's peace, you will have peace. Okay? If the city to which you are exiled has peace, you will have peace. Yes, that's a pasuk from Yirmiyahu, which I clipped and used as the title. I really should have put it in the source sheet as a source, but it's there anyway as the title. Now, what does that pasuk tell us about our relationship to the government under which we live?
I want to sit over there.
Sure. Sure. What does the pasuk tell us about our relationship to the government under which we live?
Responsibility.
Responsibility, what do you mean by that?
We have a responsibility for the welfare of the
Okay,
place.
great. One thing, we have to care about the welfare of the government under which we live. We don't just say, whatever, Heather, who cares? Next. What else does it tell us? Yes?
We're players in the game.
Okay.
We're equal with everyone else.
Great. What else does it tell us? What does it tell us about the nature of our concern with the government under which we live? What's our investment in the government under which we live?
It needs to be successful
Why?
so that we can be
Okay,
successful.
so it is not some kind of idealistic sense that this is some enterprise that needs to be advanced or elevated, right? It is a sense that in her peace, we will have peace.
Reciprocal.
So why do you seek out the peace of the city to which you have been exiled? Because if that city has peace, the Jews who are living in that city will have peace. If that country is peaceful, if that empire is successful, the Jews who are living under it will be well off. It does not necessarily reflect any sense of shared or aligned values. It doesn't necessarily reflect the sense that this government is righteous or just, you're not praying for them because they're good people or because they're doing the right thing or because they're saintly or even because you share fundamental values. You're just praying for them because in their well-being, you will also be well off. Okay? It's a self-interested way of engaging with the government under which you live. Okay? So yes, you are praying for the well-being of the government, and presumably if God grants your prayers and that government, that society are successful, peaceful, well off, a lot of people will benefit. But your interest is neither primarily altruistic, let's just help these people out, nor is it primarily one of shared values. It is primarily one of looking out for your own interests by seeking that government's interest.
Gain. Personal gain.
Now, if we think about the Jews' experience with Bavel at the time that Yirmiyahu was giving them this prophecy, this kind of approach makes perfect sense. Why? Why does it make perfect sense that the extent of my concern for the well-being of Bavel is my own well-being and not either some sense of deep shared values or some altruistic sense that I care about how the Babylonians are doing?
Yeah, but the Jews did very well in Babel. They weren't discriminated against.
But wait, they're going to Bavel now, and Yirmiyahu is saying to them on their way to Bavel, pray for the well-being of the government that you're going to so that you do well. Not because you care about them, not...
It's a temporary situation. Theoretically, it's a temporary situation. You're only there as long as the exile lasts, so that you need it to be peaceful so that you can survive long enough for the exile to end and you to return.
Okay. Even more than that, remember the circumstances under which they went into exile, right? It wasn't exactly like, somebody bought them tickets on American Airlines and flew them to whatever the capital of Bavel was, right? They were forced out of their land, their temple was destroyed, a lot of people were killed. It wasn't like there was any love lost at this point in time between the Jews and the Babylonians, right? This was not a match, of the ages. It just was, that's where they were. So that's where you are, you might as well pray for them to have peace, so you have peace. It certainly was not any sense of shared values, deep comedy, alignment, or anything else. They were comedy, C-O-M-I-T-Y, right? Alignment, they were brought there forcibly, didn't want to go, but nevertheless pray for the well-being of the society so that in their peace you have peace. Given that, it's actually interesting to think about the fact that, that in the Tanakh narrative, just a few short decades later, when they're given the opportunity to leave Bavel and go back to Israel, a whole lot of them say, sorry, we're good here, we don't want to leave. That's an interesting conversation, but a different conversation, not for right now. It does not take very long for these exiles who, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and we wept as we remembered Zion, to turn into, yeah, no thanks, you guys go back without us, we got it good here. That's a different conversation, but an interesting conversation, okay? So source number one in terms of how we relate to the broader government around us. Source number two, which is actually labeled number one on your sheet, comes from Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is a Mishnah in Mishnayot, and in this Mishnah, Rabbi Hanina Skan Kohanim tells us how he thinks we should relate to government. Do we have a volunteer to read for us, Hebrew or English? You have it in both. What does Rabbi Hanina say about our relationship to government? Henry, take it away. No, wait, no. Source before that.
Easier read.
Let me try this. Rabbi Hanina Sgan HaKohanim Amar Havei Metpalel B'Shluma Shamachut Sha'al Malam Ish Et Ba'eu Chayim
Balu.
Thank you. So Rabbi Hanina says, pray for the welfare of the government, because if not for the fear of government, man would swallow his fellow man alive. Ish et re'ehu chayim bila'o. So, what's Rabbi Hanina saying we should do? What's his ask?
Give it up for the government.
Well, he's saying pray for the welfare of the government. It's the same thing Yirmiyahu was asking for, right? The same word even, shloma, the shalom, right? Dershu et shlom ha'ir, havei mipalel b'shloma shel malchut. Pray for the well-being of the government. Why should you pray for the well-being of the government here?
For survival.
Okay, so it's interesting, survival protecting us from whom?
From each other.
From each other, right? It's not, if the city doesn't do well, then the Jews living in the city don't do well. It's like even we with each other, without the rule of law, without the sense that we are living under a system of government that maintains accountability. So even if the government is terrible for every other reason, and you hate it for every other, rotten for every other reason, just for maintaining a rule of law that people don't, loot, pillage, kill, it's worth praying for the well-being of government. Again, the orientation is fundamentally one of
Survival.
yourself.
we're taking care of ourselves. I'm not praying for the well-being of government. Again, it sounds obvious now, but when we start to talk about American citizenship, we're going to find ourselves talking about very different things, where we're going to be talking about alignment, perhaps, maybe, and thinking about between Jewish values and American values, values of citizenship, what it means to be a Jew and a citizen. None of that here, right? None of that here. Yes values, no values. What's it about? It's about our basic self-interest, which is advanced by having a society with the rule of law. Having a society in which there is a sense that there are rules and there are limits and everything else. Okay?
It's one of the 7 Noachide mitzvahs.
Yes, it is. That you are required, even a non-Jew, according to Judaism, a non-Jew is required to follow 7 commandments, and one of them is to live in a society governed by laws, is to live under the rule of law, because without the rule of law, man would swallow his fellow man alive. Whatever lovely vision somebody might have of some peaceful anarchist collective, Pirkei Avot is very, very suspicious about what would happen if you ever got yourself an anarchist collective, and they don't assume that it would be peaceful. Okay? Now, as I was collecting sources for this a while ago, I started to poke around looking for the roots of the Noten Shu'ah Lamlachim prayer that many of us say in shul on Shabbat, praying for the well-being of the government under which we live. And I think that I kind of thought, before I started to look into it, that it was a relatively modern prayer. It was like a 20th century prayer or something like that, around the same time that we write the Tefillah L'Shalom HaMdina for the state of Israel. So I don't know if this came, so not at all, actually. This tefillah for the well-being of the government is centuries old. It's first written down by the Abud Raham in medieval Spain, okay? So this is actually a very, very old prayer, which is very interesting, and I'm soon going to tell you that the American Jewish historian Jonathan Sarna makes a point about a change that was made to this prayer in America. But it's a very old prayer, and in the course of poking around looking for it, I found like the actual coolest thing. So before we look at the prayer, I'm going to tell you about the actual coolest thing. The actual coolest thing is your next source, Rabbi Menashe ben Israel, Rabbi Menashe ben Israel to Oliver Cromwell, 1655. So here's the story, okay? The Jews had been expelled from England all the way back, hundreds of years ago, the medieval period, under King Edward. The Jews are out of England. The Jews have been out of England for hundreds of years. Right? You probably famously heard this, because somebody probably told you at some point that when William Shakespeare wrote his play, The Merchant of Venice, with its very anti-Semitic depiction of a Jewish merchant, there hadn't been a Jew in England at that point already for hundreds of years, because the Jews have been banned from England for hundreds of years. So that's a fact that people are aware of. What happens in England is that in the mid-1600s, England has a civil war, and they chop off the head of King Charles I. And they install for a brief period of time, they have a commonwealth led by a man who's called the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, and that lasts a pretty short period of time, a little bit more than a decade, and then the commonwealth is ended, and instead what happens is there is what's called the Restoration. They restore the monarchy, and in 1660 they bring back King Charles II, and then England continues to be a monarchy until this very day. But there's this window of time of a little bit more than a decade in which England is not a monarchy, and instead it's this commonwealth under the Lord Protector, and it is during that period of time where people start pushing for England to readmit the Jews, which actually ends up happening under Cromwell, that England does in fact allow Jews back into England. Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael is a rabbi in the Jewish community in Amsterdam. As many are, he was a descendant of a family that fled the Iberian Peninsula, in his case Portugal, right? That's why the synagogue in Amsterdam is the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, because it's Jews from Spain and Portugal who fled Spain and Portugal, ending up in Amsterdam, and of course that's the same reason, that's sort of down the line how we get the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York is the same kind of thing. Jews who fled the Iberian Peninsula who ended up in South America, who then end up in New York, in New Amsterdam. Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael, who's a very fascinating figure in his own right, takes up the cause of getting the Jews readmitted to England as his own cause. And in fact moves to England and lives in England for a while to argue the case that England should officially, legally readmit the Jews. And he's involved in all kinds of public discussion and political lobbying, whatever political lobbying looked like exactly in the 1650s, for the Jews to be readmitted to England. And as part of this, he actually writes a letter to Cromwell in which he includes the entire text of the Noten Shu'ah Lamlachim prayer, along with his own translation. What do you think he was probably trying to show Cromwell? What? Jews are great citizens. We're loyal to, or great subjects, whatever it is. We're great people within any country we live. We're loyal to the king. And so this is all what you have here in source number 3 is from the letter Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael writes to Cromwell, and you can see from the spelling, this is 17th century spelling, so they haven't quite standardized English spelling yet, so you basically spell stuff the way you want to spell it. And my students would love if that was still the rule about English spelling, but it's not anymore. Now you actually have to spell things right. An evident sign of the proper and natural resolution of this nation and their constant obedience to their princes. The same affection is confirmed by the inviolable custom of all Jews wheresoever they live. For on every Sabbath or festival day, they everywhere are used to pray for the safety of all kings, princes, and commonwealths under whose jurisdiction they live, of whatever protection soever, unto which duty they are bound by the prophets and the Talmudists, from the law, as by Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, that's the pasuk we just read. Yeshua Shalom Ha'ir. Seek out the peace of the city unto which I have made you wander, and pray for her unto the Lord, for in her peace you shall enjoy peace. Okay? From that continual and never broken custom of the Jews, wheresoever they are, I skip to the next paragraph, on the Sabbath day or other solemn feasts, at which time all Jews from all places come together to the synagogue after the benediction of the holy law, before the minister of the synagogue blesseth the people of the Jews with a loud voice, he blesseth the prince of the country under which they live, that the Jews may hear it and say Amen. And then he gives the entire text of the prayer. He then gives the entire text of the prayer. So when I wanted to include the prayer in my source sheet, I actually found myself having a hard time because none of the online sources that exist to help you create source sheets have this tefillah of Hanotenchu Alam Lachim as part of them. Sefaria, which is maybe the most famous one, has the whole Siddur, but the whole Siddur, they have like the standard everyday davening. You can't find Hanotenchu Alam Lachim. I tried, I went here and there and everywhere, so finally what I did is I scanned in a page from the Koran Siddur. I took it over to our photocopying machine, I made a scan, I emailed it to myself, I cut it, I pasted it, and that was how I got it in here. Okay? Hanotenchu Alam Lachim, so this all talks about, the opening of the prayer talks about God. Not about the prince, but about God. That God gives salvation to kings, God gives dominion to the princes, God's monarchy or God's kingdom extends to the whole world, right? So we're talking about how all dominion, all monarchy, all rulership flows from God, okay? Who, God, I'm now in the middle of the third line, Yivarech, he should bless, v'yishmor, v'yinsor, v'yazor, he should watch over and guard and elevate and uplift, and it goes on in all kinds of verbs that mean to raise and exalt and elevate and uplift. So now what our nusach of the tefillah says, et hanasi v'et mishnehu, the president and his vice president, okay? The president and his vice president. Interestingly, in Cromwell's letter, Cromwell goes through the whole text of the prayer, and he translates it in English, and he stops and he says, and here they insert the name of the king or the prince or whoever it is. Professor Jonathan Sarna, who's the dean of American Jewish historians, writes a lot about American Jewish history, points out that was actually a change that was made in the United States. So this is sort of like getting ahead of ourselves, which we're going to get in our own citizenship conversation. In the United States, where it's no longer about the particular individual holding the office. It's not about this king who rules by divine right of kings because God said he's supposed to rule, but it is about the office that somebody has been elected to. And so we actually don't name the people in this version of the prayer, we don't name, that we say in the United States, we don't name the people who hold the office. It's about the president and the vice president rather than particular individuals. We're asking that office be, and the inhabitants of that office be upheld and exalted in their capacity as the inhabitants of that office. So Jonathan Sarna makes that point that was actually an American Jewish innovation. Until then, the specific leader or ruler had been named, which is in fact what Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael says to Cromwell. Yikes, it's getting late. Okay. What Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael says to Cromwell in his letter, that the leader is named, at this point in the prayer, the leader is named. And so again, from this tefillah, we see a few things. We see the sense of praying on behalf of the ruler, but the praying on behalf of the ruler, as you continue, the prayer says, and again, the prayer is directed towards God, and we say to God, that birachamav, in his mercy, yitain bilibam, God should place in their hearts, ubelev kol yoatzehem, in the hearts of all their advisors, la'asot tova imanu v'im kol Yisrael, to do good to us and to all of Klal Yisrael. Okay, and so again, we see in this prayer, yet again, that this is not a prayer for the government under which we live in and of itself or in its essence. It's prayer for the government under which we live in the spirit of that pasuk from Yirmiyahu, which again, Rabbi Menashe ben Yisrael quotes in his letter to Cromwell, which is to say that in their peace, we will have peace. And so that was the sort of the general approach that we see towards praying for the well-being of our government. I'm going to tell you one story about this prayer, and then we're going to move on to look at source 4, which maybe shifts the conversation a little bit. Here's a story about the prayer. I would class the story in the under the heading of legend. Rabbi Beryl Wine, who himself is, something of a Jewish historian, says about legends that legends may not be true, but that the legends that they tell about the Chafetz Chaim are different than the legends that they tell about Richard Nixon. By which he means that you have to know how to read the legends, right? So don't read it as necessarily this is a provable historical event that happened in a particular time, but it tells you something about a feeling and a thought process and approach. I'll sometimes tell it to my students in history class. I'll tell them something else. I can't prove to you this is true. It tells us something about how people felt about a particular person, that they told this story about that person, whether or not the story actually happened. So let's not view it as history, but it's indicative of how people felt about it. So this is a story about Rabbi Elia Chaim Meisels of Lodz. Rabbi Elia Chaim Meisels was the rabbi in the town of Lodz in the 19th century. And the following story, there was a pogrom in the town, or just a rampaging through the shul by local youths, and they ransacked the shul. Tore up all the sidurim, threw all the papers on the floor, destroyed everything. And somebody comes into shul. Rabbi Elia Chaim Meisels had a reputation as being extremely clever, extremely sharp, extremely clever. Somebody comes into shul, and they find the rabbi in the wreckage of the shul, sort of on the floor, sifting through the scraps of the torn up sidurim. I'm like, well, what are you doing here? I'm digging through I'm looking for something. He's looking, and he goes digging through the pages of the torn up sidur until he finds a torn page with Hanoten Shu'alam Lachim on it, with the name of the ruler printed there, God should elevate whatever his name was. And then with that paper in hand, he went to the local police to say to them, you see what these thugs did? They disrespected the monarch. Now clearly you have to do something about it. When the local police might not have been so eager to prosecute or to look into a case of ransacking or destroying the local shul, but surely, desecrating a prayer for the elevation and exaltation of the monarch, that
Would
clearly
get
has to
them moving.
That clearly has to be taken seriously. Okay, so that's as far as we're going to go in developing the idea that for a very extended time in Jewish history, we see the development of this approach, which is we pray to God for the well-being of the government. We are concerned with the well-being of the country under which we live, but it's not out of any particular sense of investment in or commitment to this particular government. No love lost necessarily. It's out of a sense that our own well-being will best be guaranteed by safety and security in the country under which we live. I want to start to potentially frame things to think about a different approach, what our approach looks like as American citizens, which I don't think is just, the United States is doing well economically and things are peaceful, so we're fine, and that's the extent of our investment in this enterprise. Or at least let me be explicit, putting my cards on the table. That's not how I feel, and it's not how I would want our students to feel, that the extent of my investment in this enterprise of the United States that we live under is like, if we're doing well financially, and if we're safe, and the garbage gets cleaned off my streets, and my taxes aren't too high, then I'm good, and that's all that I care about. That's not exactly the relationship as citizens with this enterprise called the United States that I would want my students to have. And then the question becomes, what is an alternative Jewish model for thinking about how to relate to the society under which we live? So Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, who is the head of Shalom Harmon Institute in North America, at one point this year I heard him say that in thinking about what it means to be an American and a Jew in this particular time, one of the sets of sources that he finds himself moved to go back to and look at are the sources in the Gemara that talk about the relationship with the Roman Empire. Because he says you find a lot that's instructive in there for our present moment. While the Roman Empire, obviously earlier on, the year 68, 70 CE, destroys the second Beit HaMikdash and exiles the Jews, by the time of the Talmud Bavli, that we're reading about, we're often reading about more positive and more mixed relationships between the Jews and the Roman Empire, and thinking about what it means to live under the dominant world power, and sometimes to have a complicated relationship with it, and sometimes to have a positive relationship with it, and what does that look like? And so in the interest of that, once he said that, that sort of spurred my thinking about some famous Gemarot that some of you may have heard, that kind of set that dynamic up for us. So this Gemara that we are looking at here is actually a prequel to a very famous story that a lot of you know about. Do we have this? Something here has to be an extra. There you go.
Thank you.
A prequel to a very famous story here. Anyhow, prequel to a very famous story you know about, and the famous story you know about is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai running away and hiding in a cave. Do we remember that? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is running away and hides in a cave and lives in a cave for a long time, 12 years, and then for another year, and then he finally comes out. Why does Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai run away and hide in a cave? Because the Romans want to kill him. Why do the Romans want to kill him? The Romans want to kill him because of this story. This is how we get to the Romans want to kill Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So do we have a volunteer to read us this story about why it is that the Romans decide they want to kill Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? Great. Thanks.
In this Breitzer, Rabbi Yehuda is described as head of the speakers in every place. The Gemara asks, and why did they call him head of speakers in every place? The Gemara relates that this resulted due to an incident that took place when Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon were sitting in, and Yehuda, son of convert, sat beside them.
So I just want to stop a second to make clear, Rabbi Yehuda and Yehuda in this story are two different people. Keep going.
Rabbi Yehuda opened and said, how pleasant are the actions of this nation, the Romans, as they established marketplaces, established bridges, and established bathhouses. Rabbi Yossi was silent. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai responded and said, everything that they established only for their own purposes. They established marketplaces to place prostitutes in them, bathhouses to pamper themselves, and bridges to collect taxes from all who pass over them.
Okay, let's just stop a minute and make sure that we understand the plot before we get on to what's happening next, okay? So Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon are having a conclave, and they're all talking. And Rabbi Yehuda opens the conversation, and what does he say?
Romans are great.
The Romans are great. We have aqueducts, we got clean water, we have roads right over. The Romans were great engineers. All roads lead to Rome because the Romans built great roads. Hadrian's Wall is still standing there in England. You can see Roman aqueducts, stuff they built that's like still around, right, lasting forever. So these Romans are great. They did all these great things for us. Rabbi Yossi's quiet, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says,
It was all selfish.
all selfish, nothing doing. Had nothing to do with benefiting us. They did it for their own good. We don't owe the Romans any thanks. Okay, now you can continue.
Yehuda, son of converts, went and related their statements to his household, and those statements continued to spread until they were heard by the monarchy. They ruled and said, Yehuda, who elevated the Roman regime, shall be elevated and appointed head of the sages, the head of the speakers in every place. Yossi, who remained silent, shall be exiled from his home in Judea as punishment, and sent to the city of Tzipori in the Galilee. And Shimon, who denounced the government, shall be killed.
So each of them is responded to according to how they reacted to or how they spoke about or treated the Romans. Rabbi Yehuda, who said the Romans are great, he's going to be elevated. Rabbi Yossi was silenced, being exiled. And Shimon Bar Yochai, who said the Romans are actually terrible, he's going to be killed, at which point he runs away with his son and hides in a cave.
I just also think Rabbi Shimon's reaction is interesting because it requires that things be good only if they're done for us in mind. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda could be saying, these things are great and we indirectly benefit from them, even if they aren't built for us per se, if it's not for our betterment. But somehow Rabbi Shimon thinks like if it wasn't built for expressly for us and our betterment, then it's negative.
Right. And yes. And this question about how we relate to good things the government does for us, even if it does them for its own ends, this for us living under the American regime, which is a Malchut HaChesed, which does a lot of good things for Jews as individuals and Jews collectively, but may not do them at all out of any particular love for Jews. It may do them for all kinds of political considerations. I want to get votes from certain groups of all kinds of things. How do we think about it?
Because it's good for Christians.
And how do we interact with that?
There's an edge to it, being cynical about the Malchut, about whoever's in power, and almost Rabbi Hillel had to dig to find what was wrong with each of those good things, as if to say, to keep himself separate, which I think needs to be part of our conversation.
And it's a little bit characteristic of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, because if you remember the end of that story, he's in the cave for a long time with his son, and they hang out in the cave for years and years and years studying Torah, right? The water spring, the carob tree, you all remember this, and then somebody made you eat carob on Tu B'Shvat, and you're like, what is this? But they made you eat it because you were supposed to eat it. And then he comes out of the cave. And what happens when he comes out of the cave?
He sees people living.
He sees a farmer farming and he says, what are you doing? You should be studying Torah.
That's exactly what he does. He sees people engaged in the work of the world, and he's very angry at them for being engaged in the work of the world, not doing the most elevated things they could have been doing when they're doing kind of prosaic, day-to-day, let's just live in the world, and let's farm, and let's be who we are, right? And so the Gemara says he looked at the farmer and like burned him up, zapped him up with his eyes, and then what happens? Do you remember this?
God puts him back in the cave.
God says to him, I didn't take you out of the cave to destroy my world. You're not doing me any favors being on such a lofty spiritual and religious level that the normal day-to-day business of living in this world is so offensive to you that you're like zapping people for the normal day-to-day business of living in this world. It's wonderful that you're so spiritually elevated and you're so holy, but like for most people, they need to be doing the just day-to-day business of living in the world. So you can kind of see a connection between that and what they did in the world they didn't do for the right reasons or for the elevated enough reasons or for the proper reasons, that sense of living yourself on a very, very, very high standard, but then being critical of everybody else who doesn't live up to your same elevated standard. There's kind of a through line with that to when he comes out of the cave, at which point God says to him, go back in the cave for another year and you can come back out when you're ready to accept that like people in the world are people in the world, and that's how they function. So there is that line. But this question that this puts on the table, this question of how do we relate to a government that does things that are of enormous benefit to us, whether or not they were done to benefit us, is really going to be the opening up of the conversation that we're going to continue with, which is how do we think about and relate to an American government, where we're not simply talking about let's pray for their well-being, because if there's peace and prosperity in the United States, we will all be better off, although that is certainly true, right? Better the United States be peaceful and rich than poor and at war. That's not a hard case to make. But even with that, even beyond that, how do we relate to this government and the society that has done so much to benefit us? And when I say done so much to benefit us, I now want to frame that in a way that goes beyond the physical benefits, the infrastructure benefits, the material benefits that we're talking about here. Right here, we're talking about bathhouses and marketplaces, roads, bridges, whatever it is. And there's certainly, the United States has done plenty of that for us, right? There's plenty of infrastructure. On Sunday of this week, I told my students this on Monday when I spoke to them in davening. On Sunday of this week, I guess because it was like 100 degrees below zero, we lost water on our couple of surrounding blocks. The water main broke. And I guess the water main broke because I guess some froze, I don't know. And so we had no water in my apartment building in Washington Heights for about 10 hours. And living for 10 hours without running water gives you a great sense of appreciation for the fact that you live the entire rest of your life with running water. I actually do sometimes tell this to my students, so this is for posterity because it's on the live stream. But I tell my students all the time, I ask them, what invention do you think changed your life the most? And they say the internet, they say this, they say that. I say, there's no question that you're wrong, because what I'm about to tell you is indubitably the right answer, and the answer is indoor plumbing. The fact that you do not have to use an outhouse or whatever, it is unarguable. I could take away your phone and you could live without the internet, and yeah, you'd fetch and wine and carry on, but you'd live, right? Think about life without indoor plumbing. So the United States, the states, the localities are maintaining all this infrastructure and services that we count on, that brings us our water and our electricity and our phone and but when we talk about the things that the United States has created that benefit us, we don't just mean physical improvements in physical infrastructure, and it's important to talk about that as well. Because there are all kinds of other things that have been built or created, not in the realm of physical things, but in the realm of laws, norms, institutions, structures of government from which we benefit from enormously, right? The presumption that we are entitled to practice our religion without any governmental interference, and that indeed anything that imposes any kind of burden on us because we are Sabbath observant or kashrut observant, like what on earth is that, right? You can't make it harder for me because I keep Shabbat. You got to accommodate Shabbat. My students take it for granted that the universe is supposed to accommodate Shabbat for them, and they take it for granted because they live in a world that mostly does, right? And if you say to them, well, you can't do that. What do you mean I can't do it on Saturday? So give me an SAT on Sunday, right? What do you mean I can't take the test? There was a time when colleges used to give Saturday exams, and if you couldn't take a Saturday exam, you couldn't take a Saturday exam, right? That's not a language that my students understand. They live in a world that's extremely accommodating of their religious lives and observance, and they live in that world because the United States has created, through the Constitution, through the laws, but also through the norms, right? Through the expectation that we are a society that makes space for all kinds of religious observances. There are and have been prominent people in American life who are observant Jews and who are able to structure their high-level involvement in American political life around their being observant Jews. And everybody gets that, and that's part of the story, and nobody expects you to hide that or pretend you're not or whatever it is. Again, in every realm now of life, my students expect they will have access to whatever opportunities they want to have access to whatever professions they want to have access to, and that none of that will be limited in any way by their being religious and observant Jews. We expect the government to provide certain kinds of support, protection, assistance to us, to our institutions, all of those kinds of things. And so beyond the physical infrastructure of the things it spends money on, the things it builds, the things it creates, the ideas that it puts into place, like that everybody should have freedom of conscience and the ability to practice their religion the way they want, and nobody should be discriminated against or suffer or be excluded in society. I remember as a kid, how old was I? Yeah, pretty much a kid, listening to President George H.W. Bush talk about some program he was launching. I'm sure if I used Google I could find it out. And in the course of illustrating that students in this program could attend religious colleges, I think that's what it was, and use the funding to attend religious colleges or whatever it was, he mentioned a Catholic school, and then he mentioned Yeshiva University. And I was listening to the President of the United States list Yeshiva University as a way of making clear that anyone in any religious faith or, any institution that was affiliated with any religious belief system could, I think, again, it was spend this money in that institution, but I can look it up for next time and find out exactly what it was that President Bush mentioned Yeshiva University in the context of. And that message of inclusion, that message of us being part of this, is very powerful. Again, some of it's mandated by Constitution or by laws, some of it's not, but it's just the practices that have evolved and have become accepted as a result of what the Constitution and the laws say, which again we benefit from enormously. I think to some extent we may have come to take for granted, and part of thinking about what it means to be a citizen in the United States is actually thinking about being conscious of and aware of those things. And I don't have to think, says Rabbi Yehuda, that those things were created for my benefit, for my own personal particular benefit, in order to be grateful and appreciative of them. I can say, well, they were created for the benefit of Christian religious minorities. I can say they were created, all the reasons I can talk about why they were created, but at the end of the day, I as a Jew benefit enormously from a society that expects that my religious observance and the outward manifestations of my religious observance shouldn't stop me, right? I have the whole long list of life stories of all the places I've gone in life wearing a hat, and that I go wearing a hat, and they say take off the hat, and I'm like, no, I wear the hat for religious reasons, and then I go through wearing a hat. When I was doing research for my doctoral dissertation, I spent 2 summers at the National Archives, and the National Archives had very strict security rules, not because they're worried about what you'll bring into the National Archives, but because they're worried about what you'll smuggle out. They don't want you rolling up any valuable historical documents, sticking them under your hat, and walking out, And so you can't go into, this is totally true, you can't go into the National Archives, the research facility. I'm not talking about where you visit as a tourist. But like the research facility where you sit with the documents, you can't go into the National Archives with a hat. Unless you show up with a letter saying you wear a hat for religious reasons, which I did, in which case you can, go into the National Archives in a hat. So the things that the United States has done for us and the things that we benefit from the United States are not limited to the physical improvements in the physical infrastructure. They include also this realm of ideas, principles, norms, laws, rules about how we relate to Jews who, as members of what one Supreme Court justice once called the most despised minority in history, we're acutely sensitive to being in a country in which that's protected and in which we are not treated that way. A third category I think that's worth mentioning here, that I'm not sure whether you put it in the category of, sort of the physical infrastructure or the norms and the rules or both places or neither place, and it's its own third category, is the support for the State of Israel, okay? Material support, support on the world scene, and all those other kinds of things. Where again, you can say, well, they're doing it for political reasons and it doesn't even have anything to do with Jews, and they're Christian Zionists who are very powerful political, like that could all be true, right? We don't have to be silly about this. We can have, we can be political analysts. We can understand what's going on here. And then at the same time, we can say, well, even with that, even if I know that, how do I think about, relate to, and engage with the society that has afforded me these benefits? I'm going to say one more thing that I think about. I'm trying to think if I should say it or not. I'll say one more thing I think about when I read this Gemara, which I'm not sure is of any significance, but I think about it when I read this Gemara, which is there's a famous midrash that when Paro says, just recently in the parsha, any baby boy who's born should be thrown in the river. And the Midrash says that Paro has 3 advisors. And the 3 advisors react 3 different ways. Bilam says, you go, Paro, that's an awesome idea, you should throw all the Jewish baby boys in the river. Yitro says, that's a terrible idea, you should not do anything like that. And then he's exiled, he has to run away because Paro wants to kill him, and according to this Midrash, that's how Yitro ends up where he is when Moshe comes and finds him and ends up as the son-in-law. And Eov, the 3rd advisor who keeps silent, having watched what happened with the first 2, he saw Bilam say it was a great idea. Well, Eov didn't think it was a great idea. He saw Yitro say it was a terrible idea. Paro didn't listen to him, didn't accept that it was a terrible idea. And Yitro just has to flee. He ends up in exile. So he's like, well, there's no point in speaking up, is there? And so he keeps quiet. And according to that Midrash, that's why Eov ends up suffering all the things that he suffers in the book of Eov, in the book of Job, as a result of his silence in the face of the evil decree. I only think it's interesting because those 3 responses are identical to these 3 responses, right? Speaking up in the positive, speaking up in the negative, and keeping silent. I'm not sure what to make of that or whether there's any particular deep significance to that, but it's striking to me. There was a 20th century economist and social thinker named Albert O. Hirschman, who wrote a very famous book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, in which he says that when faced with, he's actually talking about people in government or in an organization, in a corporation. When they see the organization doing something that they think is wrong, they have 3 choices. The 3 choices are exit, they can leave; voice, they can speak up against it; or loyalty, they can go along and support it. So I've always thought of exit, voice, and loyalty in the context of that midrash, and you sort of see parallel things here. I'm not sure if there's any significance to that or not, but that strikes me as interesting. Okay, so where are we planning to go from here? This first class was really setting up a broad introduction of approaches to how we think about our relationship with the government under which we live. We looked at a lot of sources that talk about a long chain, well, not that many sources, but we looked at some sources that talk about a very long chain going all the way to the destruction of the first temple and Yirmiyahu HaNavi, the prophet Jeremiah, that talk about seeking out the well-being of the government under which you live solely because that is how you are going to be best protected and most well off. And then we started to look at a source that introduces at least another way of thinking, which is whether or not they did it for my own good, whether or not they had me in mind, particularly when they did it, I can still be appreciative and grateful of the benefit that accrued to me from this government, this empire, this society, doing things that I benefit from enormously. We as American Jews live under a government that functions that way for us. First of all, it does all kinds of things just in the realm of infrastructure and how life functions that we benefit from tremendously. And beyond that, we talked about some of the things that we particularly as Jews benefit from, not just the aqueducts and the markets and the roads and the bridges that everybody benefits from, but that we as Jews particularly benefit from. Societally, norms around freedom of religion, around protections of religious minorities, around protections of ethnic minorities, that we as Jews benefit from so much that I don't think my students think about themselves as a minority. They're like so comfortable and so at ease and so think that this country and this world are going to work for them the way they want them to work for them, that they don't even particularly think of themselves as a minority, which by the way is not only true about us, it's true about people thinking about us in general. Years ago, I was,
We're not.
I'm sorry?
We're not. The difference between us and the Romans, all the European things are, there we were living on the, because the king would let us live and he could throw us out at any time. But here, thanks to George Washington and Jefferson, we are citizens.
So that's what we're getting to next time. Great, hold on to that word, citizenship. We're getting to citizenship next time.
We are citizens.
We're getting to citizens next time. But citizenship didn't always, I have to say, Jews were always citizens and weren't always treated, even within the United States, with the level, with the absolute sense of ease, comfort. I'm going to tell you two quick stories about this. One is an older story and one is a more recent story. Here's the older story. I was I was doing research about scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project, who worked on the atomic bomb project, many of whom were Jewish. And it turns out that when you read the FBI security files about the atomic bomb scientists, they are full of the craziest anti-Semitic stuff you could ever hope to see. The FBI, which was a very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant institution, did not like these Jewish scientists any farther than it could throw them, especially since some of them were refugees from Europe, which anyway was a lot of hostile countries, and even the ones who weren't refugees from Europe didn't like them either. And the FBI files are full of really rank anti-Semitism. They talk about people being Jewish but not acting Jewish. You can only imagine what that means. Being Jewish but not sounding Jewish. One of the people they write about, he's Jewish but he doesn't sound Jewish, was Frank Friedman Oppenheimer, J. Robert Oppenheimer's younger brother. He grew up here in Fieldston, right here in Fieldston. He went to the Fieldston School, so he got an elite private school education from a very acculturated Jewish family, born in the United States, and they write about him like he just got off the boat from Schnippeschuck. You know, he's Jewish, but he doesn't sound Jewish. What does that even mean? The guy's and never mind that they say he's Jewish, but he doesn't act Jewish. I won't even ask about that. They write all kinds of things in the security files about Jews. It's really pretty eye-opening. So I wrote a paper about this. I delivered a paper about this at a conference, and I got enormous pushback from the professional historians in the audience. They couldn't accept, I was quoting primary source documents at them. I don't think I was making anything up. They couldn't accept that what these scientists were facing was actually anti-Semitism. And they were trying to come up with all kinds of other explanations as to why they faced the hostility they faced other than accepting anti-Semitism as the explanation. It was so striking. It was so strange that, well, maybe it was this and maybe it was that, but it couldn't really quite have been the anti-Semitism that you're calling it as, that a colleague of mine in graduate school came over to me after I presented the paper, and she said, well, Rebecca, maybe the Jews really did smell bad. She didn't mean the Jews really did smell bad. She was making fun. She was making fun of all the academics who were saying, well, maybe there's really a good reason they were treated that way. But I realized afterwards it was because Jews have been so successful in the United States that it's hard for people to imagine that in the 1930s, Jews faced real, meaningful anti-Semitism in this country and obstacles to the professions. And given the evolution of norms against public anti-Semitism and against treating ethnic and religious minorities that way, Jews are now so successful that it's hard for people, even professional historians, to imagine or to remember or to accept that there was a time when that wasn't that way. So that's a much longer ago story. Here's a much more recent story. I teach advanced placement classes. Advanced placement classes means they're supposed to be college level classes. The curriculum is written by the college board and the tests are written by the college board. We don't administer our own tests at the end of the year, and then the tests are centrally scored. We mail the tests back to the college board or ship them, whatever we do, and they gather everybody together and they grade the tests. About a decade ago, they invited me to be a grader in the subject that I teach because they need graders in the subjects that I teach. And I emailed them back and they said, well, grading the AP exam is a 7-day thing. From 8 to 4 for 7 days straight, You sit there in a basketball arena if you're grading AP US history, because there are 300,000 kids in the United States who take the AP US exam in a year, and you just sit there for 7 days straight, for 8 hours a day, grading AP US history exams. Well, torture or not torture, what about Shabbos?
Right.
So I said to them, what about Shabbos? And they're like, oh, you can't. There's no, you could go to services. They said to me, you can go to services after 4 p.m. I was like, oh, I don't think you understand how the Shabbos thing works. I'm not going to be able to. But I was really like a little bit agog that in 2000 and whatever in the United States, there's still something I can't do as a Sabbath observer. I don't remember what happened this year. I don't know if they contacted me or I contacted them. I don't remember how the conversation was initiated. But some woman from the college board calls me back to let me know that they've now changed things around and you can be a college board grader and be Sabbath observant. They figured it out for all the Shabbos observant people. There's, they're going to work everything out for everyone out because, and so she called me back to let me know this. Great. I mean, not that I, really want to go sit in a basketball arena for a week and grade AP exams, but now if I wanted to, I could do it and take off for Shabbos. We take so for granted that that's what this country is going to do for us that we ourselves sometimes forget that we're the beneficiaries of protections for racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. Right? We don't even know that we're that. We just think we're part of the majority in this country, except not quite. And so where we want to go from here is to talk about how we think about ourselves in this new context, not just as subjects of some kind of power, that if we're lucky it will be benign and it won't kill us, and if we're even luckier we'll live in peace and security so we, as its subjects living under it, can live in peace and security. But now as citizens, who have a stake, who have a voice, who have a say in this enterprise. And then the questions really become, what do we want to say to our students as committed Jews? What kind of voice do you want to exercise? What kind of say do you want to have? What are the issues that should move you to engage in politics? How should you engage, right? I don't mean what specific issues should you advance? I mean, how are we looking to advance the issues of the Jewish community? Are we looking to advance certain issues in the broader community as a whole? What are we looking to do with our voice? How do we want to exercise our voice? How do we relate to the state and the government around us? These are going to be some of the questions that we are going to engage with over the next 2 weeks. So I thank you very much, and we will be back here next Thursday, same place and time.